Extra, extra, we're back with another entry, and this topic should be a good one. It should be thought-provoking. We've never been in a scenario like this, and the uptick in police brutality and the killings of unarmed black men is what triggered this. So, in this topic, we're going to see what type of calls that law enforcement respond to the most, and what type of things could be the solution. Yep, we're trying to take money from the police. The article says there's a growing call to defund the police. Here's what it means. There's a growing group of dissenters who believe Americans can survive without law enforcement as we know it. And Americans, those dissenters believe, may even be better off without it. The solution to police brutality and racial inequalities in policing is simple, supporters say. Just defund police. It's as straightforward as it sounds. Instead of funding a police department, a sizable chunk of a city's budget is invested in communities, especially marginalized ones where much of the policing occurs. The concept's been a murmur for years, particularly following the protest against police brutality in Ferguson, Missouri, though it seemed improbable in 2014. But it's becoming a shout. With the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor at the hands of police and nationwide protests demanding reform, Minneapolis officials announced their intent to defund and disband the city's police force altogether. Does defunding the police mean disbanding the police? That depends on whom you ask, said Philip McHarris, a doctoral candidate in sociology at Yale University and lead research and policy associate at the Community Research Hub for Safety and Accountability. Some supporters of divestment want to reallocate some, but not all, funds away from police departments to social services. Some want to strip all police funding and dissolve departments. The concept exists on a spectrum, but both interpretations center on reimagining what public safety looks like, shifting resources away from law enforcement towards community resources, he said, and disbanding police is a more radical reimagining than divesting. It also means dismantling the idea that police are, quote, public stewards, end quote, meant to protect communities. Many black Americans and other people of color don't feel protected by police, McHarris said. Why defund police? McHarris says divesting funds can begin the process of ending the culture of punishment in the criminal justice system, and it's one of the only options local governments haven't tried in their attempts to end deaths in police custody. Trainings and body cameras haven't brought about the change supporters want. McHarris grew up in a neighborhood where there were, quote, real discernible threats of gun violence, end quote, and he said he never thought to call the police. That was for his own safety. Instead, he relied on neighbors who helped him navigate threats of danger. What if, he said, those people could provide the same support they showed him on a full-time basis? To explain why he supports the idea, Isaac Bryan, the director of UCLA's Black Policy Center, points to history. Law enforcement in the South began as slave patrol, a team of vigilantes hired to recapture escaped slaves. Then, when slavery was abolished, police enforced Jim Crow laws, even the most minor infractions. And today, police disproportionately use force against black people, and black people are more likely to be arrested and sentenced. Quote, that history is ingrained in our law enforcement, end quote, Bryan said. Where would those funds go? Patrice Cullors, co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, said defunding the police means reallocating those funds to support people and services in marginalized communities. Defunding law enforcement, quote, means that we are reducing the ability for law enforcement to have resources that harm our communities, end quote. Cullors said in an interview with WBUR, Boston's public radio station, quote, it's about reinvesting those dollars into black communities that have been deeply divested from. Those dollars can be put back into social services for mental health, domestic violence, and homelessness, among others. Police are often the first responders to all three, she said. Those dollars can be used to fund schools, hospitals, housing, and food in those communities too. Quote, all of the things we know increase safety, end quote, McHarris said. Why disband police? Disbanding police altogether falls on the more radical end of the police divestment spectrum, but is gaining traction. MPD 150, a community advocacy organization in Minneapolis, focuses on abolishing local police. Its work has been spotlighted since the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis police custody. Quote, "The people who respond to crisis in our community should be the people who are best equipped to deal with those crises," end quote, the organization says. Rather than, quote, "strangers armed with guns," the organization says, first responders should be mental health providers, social workers, victim advocates, and other community members in less visible roles. It argues law and order isn't abetted by law enforcement, but through education, jobs, and mental health services that low-income communities are often denied. MPD 150 and other police abolition organizations want wider access to all three. Would defunding police lead to an uptick in violent crimes? Defunding police on a large scale hasn't been done before, so it's tough to say. But there's evidence that less policing can lead to less crime. A 2017 report, which focused on several weeks in 2014 through 2015, when the New York Police Department purposely pulled back on so-called proactive policing, found that there were 2,100 fewer crime complaints during that time. The study defines proactive policing as the, quote, "systemic and aggressive enforcement of low-level violations," end quote, and heightened police presence in areas where, quote, "crime is anticipated," end quote. That's exactly the kind of activity that police divestment supporters want to end. Will defunding the police come to pass? It's radical for an American city to operate without law enforcement, but the plan is already in motion. In Minneapolis, on Sunday, 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council announced they intend to disband city's police force entirely. Quote, "We committed to dismantling policing as we know it in the city of Minneapolis and to rebuild with our community a new model of public safety that actually keeps our community safe," end quote, Council President Lisa Bender told CNN. Bender said the council still needs to discuss what to replace police with, but that the city will funnel money from police into, quote, "community-based strategies," end quote. She noted, too, that most 911 calls are from mental health services, health and EMT and fire services. Defunding is simpler than disbanding, though, and at least one mayor's already taken that step. After Californians decried a proposal to increase the Los Angeles Police Department budget to $1.86 billion, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti agreed to slash between $100 million to $150 million from the proposed funding. It's not a significant dent in the budget, but it's proof that officials are listening, Bryan said. Quote, "A week ago, defunding the police in any capacity would sound like so-called pie in the sky," end quote, he said. Quote, "Now we're talking about it. Defunding police in its entirety still might sound like so-called pie in the sky, but next week might be different," end quote. Yeah, the police gotta respect our mind. It's all logical. Y'all killing us out here. But guess what? I respect your sentiment, but the executive orange man got something to say. Trump says he's finalizing an executive order on police reform. The president rejects calls for defunding law enforcement and says changes will include allowing social workers to join officers. President Donald Trump said on Thursday he was finalizing an executive order focused on police reform, representing his first specific comments about changes to law enforcement practices since the national reckoning over police brutality caused by the killing of George Floyd. Quote, "We're working to finalize an executive order that will encourage police departments nationwide to meet the most current professional standards for the use of force, including tactics for de-escalation," end quote, Trump said at a roundtable with law enforcement in Dallas. Quote, "Also, we'll encourage pilot programs that allow social workers to join certain law enforcement officers so that they work together," end quote. Decrying calls from progressive activists to defund the police and funnel that money to other community programs, Trump said he wanted to increase investment in law enforcement. Quote, "We're not defunding police. If anything, we're going the other route," end quote, Trump said. Quote, "We're going to make sure our police are well trained, perfectly trained, they have the best equipment," end quote. The president also announced plans to build, quote, safety and opportunity and dignity, end quote, by increasing access to capital for minority-owned small businesses and confronting healthcare disparities in communities of color. The United States has been swept by protests since Floyd's death on May 25th in Minneapolis, when a white officer pinned his knee on Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes in an episode that onlookers captured on cell phone video. In the past weeks, Trump has mainly focused his ire on looters in American cities while calling on the military to intervene on the streets. The president has largely ignored the widespread peaceful protests demanding an end to police brutality. It's a lot to take in. I'm definitely supporting Minneapolis in their quest to defund cops that kill unarmed black men and take off and abuse nonviolent protesters. But you gotta watch these Black Lives Matter characters too. I heard they were funded by George Soros, and you know how all of these guys are looking at the dark races here in North America. So you just gotta watch out for the flip side of these organizations. But this is the part of the entry where we part ways. What do you think about all of this? Should we take the money we give the cops and put it into our own community organizations and police ourselves? Or do we keep funding the same people that kill unarmed black men and beat up nonviolent protesters? Hit the comment section. Talk to me. Hit the like button if you learned something from today's entry. Hit the like button if you learned how Donald Trump always opposes reform. He tries to have things on his own term, and he ignores the American people in the process, the North American people. He hasn't even paid attention to the protests, so he's not going to pay attention to what you suggest, and he's not going to respect your sentiments. This is the part of the entry where we part ways. Don't forget to leave me a like. If you want others to learn like you did from today's entry, hit the share button because I don't mind. I value your opinion. Hit the comment section for me. Talk to me. If you haven't already, subscribe. Till next time, peace.